Good evening. From Hong Kong, this is Alice Mong, Executive Director of Asia Society Hong Kong Center. I'm so delighted to welcome those of you who are joining us from outside of Hong Kong to our episode 32 of our COVID update series. And I am delighted tonight that I will be speaking with Dr. David Ho. Dr. Ho is somebody who really needs no introduction. And if you've seen his bio, and Dr. Ho has spoken to Asia Society Hong Kong many times, and is a good friend of Asia Society Hong Kong and Asia Society. So we're really delighted that Dr. David Ho, he was founding scientific director of the Aaron Diamond Research Center in New York, and now is affiliated with the Columbia University. And we're really honored that he is taking part in our COVID update episode 32. It started about 2 years ago, and in fact, we will be commemorating our second year anniversary of this series in February, when we will have the return of Professor Ben Cowling from Hong Kong University. Before I get started, I think I usually set some numbers. I think those of you who have been following, it's been a few months since we've done episode 31. Currently, coronavirus, 326 almost 327 million cases. Death worldwide has been over 5.5 million. And here in Hong Kong, we've been very lucky. Our numbers are still, the death is still only about 213 and over 13,000 cases. So in some ways, I've said to people, friends who have asked, Hong Kong, we're probably one of the safest place on earth. Because we have not been impacted the way Europe, US, and parts of the world has been. And so I wanted to take this opportunity tonight to really ask Dr. Ho some of the questions, especially with the onset of Omicron, who has just really plagued us. I thought in the summer when everybody was vaccinated, I was back in the States, that we were kind of out of the woods. I think many of us thought we were out of the woods. But unfortunately not. Hong Kong is going through a fifth wave. And so I wanted to kind of hand it over to Dr. Ho right away. David, tell us what, in your professional opinion, and having seen this virus this last 2 years, kind of tell us more about, from your perspective, how is this virus progressing? And are you surprised by the way this, especially Omicron, has hit us? So I'm going to turn it over to Dr. David Ho.
Well, thank you, Alice, and it's great to be able to join Asia Society Hong Kong Center for this discussion. Omicron is obviously dominating the conversation about COVID-19 nowadays. I think everyone knows that it emerged in Southern Africa and was detected in November. So not that long ago, and yet it has spread throughout the world and is accounting in certain places 95 to 99% of the infections. So its contagiousness is unparalleled. It's 5-6 times more infectious than the Delta variant that preceded it. And in places like the US, believe it or not, we have 7-day daily average of 800,000 cases each day. So a person could walk into the room, say a Christmas party, and spread the infection to 50 out of 100 in such a large room. So it's extremely contagious. It's not seen before for other variants of COVID-19. Its other impressive properties is it has extensive mutations that allows the virus to escape from antibodies elicited by vaccination and by previous infection. And so the vaccine efficacy, which for some of the better vaccine have been up to 95%, now against Omicron drops to 30 to 40%. So that's another property of this virus. Of course, with a vaccine booster shot, say the third shot with the better vaccines, then the protection is restored back to about 80, 85%. Fortunately, the pathogenicity or the virulence of the virus is not as great as previous variants. We believe it certainly is that way in animal models and in the human cases that have been extensively studied so far. It appears to be somewhat less pathogenic. Nevertheless, I should say at our medical center at Columbia University, for example, nowadays we have 260 patients in the hospital with COVID-19 and about 40 in the ICU. So the infection is certainly quite overwhelming for the healthcare system. And I think everyone knows that this virus has spread to the UK, Western Europe, US, and many parts of the world. Lacking behind by a week or two. And it's now peaking in the eastern seaboard of the US, and the rest of the US will probably peak in the next week or two. And then hopefully this will come down, but it's gonna rip through the country and much of the world in the coming weeks.
Can you, I'm curious, your perspective on UK. It seems like the UK is trying to kind of wait, they've thrown their hands up in some way. Somebody said UK is almost the total opposite of the way Hong Kong is dealing with it, with the zero COVID strategy, whereas UK, so do you think in a case of UK, it's also going to be peaking like the Eastern Seaboard in the United States?
Yeah, I think UK and some of the Western European countries probably have peaked and will come down, similar to New York, for example. And you're right, there's an attitude that once Omicron established itself in a given locale, it's really hard to contain it, especially given the habits of people in the West who value so much personal freedom over social responsibility. It's really tough to get people to comply with masks and distancing, and in some with vaccination. So there's no doubt that a large segment of society in the UK, in the US, and many other places are saying, well, we've given up. And so the policy is far, far off the zero COVID policy that you see in Greater China. It's a totally different attitude. Of course, the countries are suffering right now, but the saving grace for US and Western Europe will be more and more extensive vaccination. And then unfortunately, with greater Omicron infection, it's going to it's going to affect a lot of people, but in the process, raise the immunity in the population. And there's certainly the possibility that will bring a faster end to the pandemic.
But in terms of the vaccination rate, I mean, the boosters is very common now in Hong Kong. I think the booster shots, is the third booster shot. And today, reading some of the results coming in from Israel, they're saying the fourth shot, the second booster, is not as effective. So do you have any latest information about booster? Is it something that we have to do kind of like the flu every year? Is booster effective? I mean, those of us who've had the third shot, what can you kind of tell us more about your thoughts on the vaccination and booster?
Yeah, my comments will be more limited to the kind of shots that we have available in the US. So it would be based on the Pfizer-BioNTech vaccine or the Moderna vaccine or the Johnson & Johnson vaccine. And it's pretty clear that the third shot or the booster shot is making a significant difference against Omicron. But the immunity following that booster shot also wanes with time, about 5-6-fold over a 6-month period. So no doubt protection will drop. But we are also learning in the lab that by studying these people, there's not only a boosting of the level of antibodies, but there's a enhancement to the quality of the antibodies. So I think whether we need continual booster or not depends on how the quality improves with time. And I am, for one, not certain that we will need, say, an annual booster. It could be that third, fourth shot followed by occasional infection that is mild because of the protection conferred by the immunity, then you will be naturally boosted and get into a state where the pandemic is transformed into endemic situation with small waves of infection with time. That is a better scenario we could hope for.
So with that scenario, can you kind of take a, you're a professional, this is your field, in terms of like an educated guess, when will we get there in that phase? Or long-term, a few months, few weeks, or what do you think? I think people want to know, when is the end?
I think in the US, I of course could speak to the US and Western Europe situation better, because that's my experience. And I think, we're suffering so much from the infection right now, but at the same time, herd immunity is building up and vaccination is continuing to occur. So in another year of this, much of the population would be protected from severe disease. Now, that doesn't mean the population won't be infected. So there will always be some infection, because the immunity doesn't necessarily protect against infection. It protects against severe disease, hospitalization, and death. And so that we will get into a situation where in US and Europe, we don't fear the virus as much. We also, aside from the vaccines, have 2 drugs and multiple that work and could be used to treat the infection in people who are likely to develop severe disease. So the fear factor would go down, and we are already, despite the high numbers, already learning to live with the virus. And I think given the current state of affairs, I suspect it's another year or 2 before we get to a situation where we could relax and try to return to normalcy. This, of course, is in contrast to the zero COVID policy that's implemented in places. And if we're going to talk about that, I think zero COVID policy is the right thing to do at the outset of the pandemic, right? We had very little to counter the virus, and so we had to shut it down and avoid extensive spread and extensive hospitalization and death, and avoid hospitals and clinics being overwhelmed. So it is the right thing to do, and Greater China did I think, a superb job with that. But the question, as you and others are asking, is that sustainable? Of course, it's not if it's forever, right? And you have to think of a strategy out of it. So this is like a marathon, and you could say Greater China with that policy has run the initial part very well. But the question is, how are you going to finish the marathon? Because if your population is largely immunologically naive, then as soon as you open up, you're going to be susceptible to infection and spread, and the dire consequences that follow. So sooner or later, it's going to come. So the key is, while you have the zero COVID policy, how do you vaccinate the population extensively? And not all vaccines are created equal. That's a very important message to convey to this audience, because a lot of the people in Asia, particularly Greater China, are vaccinated with Sinopharm and Sinovac vaccines. And it's unfortunate, but it's pretty clear they're not as good. And so there's a ranking that the reason that America is using the two mRNA vaccines and J&J's vaccine is because they're better. The US gave away its stock of AstraZeneca vaccine, and it's pretty clear that's not as good. And Sinopharm in particular, but also Sinovac, they clearly don't elicit the right type of antibodies to the same level. So if Greater China continues to depend on those two vaccines, it's not going to get out of this situation very easily. And so it's not sustainable. I mean, you could say, oh, okay, maybe you could do it for another year or two, but are you willing to do it for 5 years? Are you going to do it for a decade? Probably not, I would say. So the only strategy out is to vaccinate extensively with the best vaccines. And even the best vaccines have problem against Omicron. So the weaker vaccines have no chance. And so, Greater China better get on with the extensive vaccination with, I would prefer the mRNA vaccines. And places like China would have the technological know-how, but it's going to take quite a while to build that up and to scale up the manufacturing to cover that size of the population. So it's not going to come readily. So you almost have to say that we're willing to buy. And this is where Israel has performed very well. It's willing to spend good dollars to buy vaccine and implement it to the population as quickly, or in fact, faster than anybody else. And that in the long run is going to protect the population very well.
Here in Hong Kong, I'm still hearing from friends, very educated people, the mistrust of the mRNA vaccine. So I'm glad to hear you talked about this. But can you kind of dispel some of the myths? They're saying the traditional way of developing vaccine is safer. I mean, even some of the medical professionals I've heard here, maybe they're a bit more conservative. They have warned people, well, initially anyway, maybe not so much now, against the mRNA vaccine. So can you talk about these two methods? I mean, one is the traditional one that is used to develop the flu and so on. Why is there such a mistrust of this mRNA, this new way of doing things in terms of the vaccine?
I think a lot of the mistrust is based on the fact that these are new, and therefore they haven't had the experience over a long period of time. But I think in terms of number of shots administered and the number of side effects reported, it's proven to be very, very efficacious. And the US and Western Europe surely are not going to take, and aim to vaccinate the entire population with a vaccine that is not safe. So the safety record is pretty well established. And given the number of doses that have been administered over the past year, and many of us have already gotten 3 shots of it. Yes, there are some side effects. You won't feel very well for 24, 36 hours, but then it's over. And there's hardly any long-term sequelae at this point. And most vaccines have their side effects early. So it's in the US, we don't even think about that. It's pretty clear that those vaccines are superior. And the side effect profiles are no different from some of the safest vaccines that have been administered in the past. Just for comparison, the Sinovac and Sinopharm vaccines are vaccines with technology from the 1950s and 1960s. And also as you prepare the virus and to kill it chemically, some of the surface protein spikes are lost or unstable, and therefore they don't elicit the best immune responses because they don't mimic the natural protein anymore. And so that is a feature, and we still produce some vaccines that way, but I think it's time to move on. And with the Omicron variant coming out, the mRNA vaccines could switch over in a matter of weeks to the new vaccine form. Whereas now you have to grow up a huge stock of the Omicron virus and kill it. It's going to take a much longer timeline. And whether the protein on the surface of a virus particle will mimic the natural state is also uncertain. And so it is pretty clear that the mRNA vaccines are more effective and safe.
Are you surprised at how fast the vaccine was developed? I remember my first conversation with Professor Cowling in February of 2020. I remember he said it'll take about 2 to 3 years for a vaccine to be developed to battle against this coronavirus. But within less than a year, this vaccine, and maybe that's another reason people were afraid of it, because it was done so fast. Are you, the pace of it, and you worked on AIDS, you still work on AIDS, and looking for that vaccine. But kind of tell us that process. Is that does it worry you? Well, in the end, I guess it's not the worrying. It's just, are you surprised at the pace of the way this vaccine came about in less than a year?
I am impressed, but I'm not completely surprised given the massive mobilization of the scientific community as well as the pharmaceutical and biotech communities to address the pandemic once Wuhan was locked down and it was apparent that this virus was going to spread globally. And the concerted effort put in by multiple governments to fund research to come up with solutions. And I, my lab responded in the same way, and I know what kind of effort our lab put in. I mean, people, move into the dormitories and worked 14, 16 hours a day to address this. And I think this took place throughout many, many parts of the world. So I'm not totally surprised. And multiple vaccines were all developed in a 6 to 9 month period, and multiple antibodies that are used for prevention or treatment were also developed at the same timeline. So it's pretty impressive concerted effort at warp speed, and that really paid off. And while U.S. and Western Europe didn't do the best job of controlling the pandemic in their own countries, these places contributed most scientifically, and will therefore help to bring a faster end to this pandemic, whenever that might be. It will largely be due to the scientific breakthroughs.
And following on that, I think you're so right about the collaboration. I mean, people, the community, scientific community, really jump on it. Is there other areas you think the government could have, government or WHO or other institution could have done better in terms of galvanizing the world at the onset? Because it seems to me there's this wave. It started here in Asia, in Hong Kong, well, Wuhan and Hong Kong, but no one really took it very seriously. Everybody's, it's not going to happen to us. Everybody, and then until it hits, I remember when it hit New York, and then you see that wave. So could the government or WHO, could somebody have done it better in terms of organizing this tackling of this pandemic? So that, because right now it's pretty spotty, and one thing we do know is the developed countries have the vaccines, but the developing countries do not. I mean, I read somewhere like a dozen countries, only about less than 25% vaccination rate, and WHO director said he would like to see by July 70% herd immunity in as many countries as possible. Do you think that's realistic? And is there a failure in this world? Well, I don't want to say failure in WHO, but what could have done better to have nip this earlier? Or are we just, because of all the countries, 190 some countries, we could never have done that. And you have work in this field. So I just kind of thought your thoughts on that.
Yeah, I think the world did not deal with this pandemic all that well. If we go back to the very beginning, once the infection was identified to be a SARS-like virus in Wuhan in late December of 2019. The initial response was delayed by a number of weeks. So the best time to put out a fire is when the ember is turning into a small fire. You could put it out. And if that had been put out, this pandemic would have been averted. So that delay was instrumental for the start of the pandemic. But as you said, there are many countries that were in denial. Foremost among them is the US, led by our former president, who said, this is going to go away. And this is akin to a situation where your next door is on fire and you say, that's not going to affect us. And in fact, to me, that's a worse mistake than what China made at the very beginning. Because at the very beginning, everything's still mysterious, not clear. But by the time Donald Trump made that mistake, it was pretty obvious, what was happening to the rest of the world. And that kind of denial was absolutely a huge mistake. And of course, plagued the US for much of 2020. I think the current situation, and there are many policy mistakes in the US. I don't necessarily want to go into them one by one, but US made lots of mistakes in this process. Most importantly is allowing lots of misinformation to be spread, and allowing the idea of freedom without responsibility to dominate the conversation. Obviously, in a public health crisis, you have to balance safety along with personal freedom, and that was not stressed enough. But I think one of the major issues right now is how do you vaccinate the entire world? And the situation is worse than you said. There are places with vaccination rates less than 5% in poorer countries. And I think to get it up to 70% by the end of this year is overly optimistic. It's just logistically very, very challenging. And it's doable, but it would take a very concerted effort on the part of all the rich countries helping the other countries. And I just don't see it. It's overly optimistic. But it needs to be done, because if you allow this virus to continue the spread, continue to replicate, it will make mutations that will lead to new variants appearing. And so who knows what the next variant is going to be like.
And this reminds me of before Omicron, I think this must have been around November, I heard from a friend at Hong Kong U who had heard from Professor Gabriel Leung, his worst nightmare, he was worried about the situation in Africa. And lo and behold, Omicron came from South Africa. So in many ways, by prolonging this virus, you have a lot of different variants popping up. What area now, what parts of the world are you worried about? Is there going to be, there's talk of, the combination of Omicron and Delta, Omicron and flu. I mean, they call it the Franken viruses. So is there a part of the world that you're now also, kind of worried about that could also see the mutations or the the way new Omicron coming on the stage?
Yeah, let's just keep in mind the history of the evolution of this virus, right? Particularly over the past 14 months or so. The alpha variant appeared in the UK, and that was more transmissible. Then, and that was in the sometime in the late summer of 2020. 2020. Then that was followed by the emergence of the beta and gamma variant in South Africa and in Brazil, respectively. The beta and gamma variant were more transmissible, more resistant to antibody. Alpha variant was even more transmissible, but did not evade antibodies all that much. And so the alpha variant came to dominate, whereas beta and gamma kind of faded. Then that was replaced by the Delta variant, right? And Delta variant was even more transmissible and also evaded antibodies. And that became dominant and replaced all the other variants. And then by late November of 2021, we have the Omicron variant that came from Southern Africa somewhere, right? And that is even more transmissible and even more evasive to antibodies. But the evolution is not linear. It's not one variant turning into another. And 4 months ago, I would have said the next important variant would be derived from Delta. And I was obviously wrong. And many in the field have said the same. So the evolution is stochastic, it's random, and it's going to come from places where the viruses are allowed to replicate at will and make mutations at will. And so now we have to be worried about not just Africa, but many places in South America or elsewhere where vaccination rates are very low. And we cannot assume that the next variant will automatically be less pathogenic, less virulent. It's not necessarily so. And so we have to be very diligent in monitoring the situation to see what will come in the coming months.
I want to thank those in the online, you're watching this online. Questions are coming in. And in fact, this question really builds very nicely on what you just talked about. This question says, recently there is a new variant called IHU discovered in France. And the question is, do you see it as a more dangerous variant while comparing it to Omicron and Delta?
Yeah, there's in the US, there's a consortium of international groups, mine included, where we track variants that appear everywhere in the world, where viruses are collected and sequenced, and we look at the sequences and we track the frequency of the variants. And there are constantly on our radar about a dozen, if not 24 viruses. And yes, there are additional Omicron variants, there are additional Delta variants. There's a variant called B1640.2. There are many variants. And as you noted earlier, there's some evidence of a recombination between Delta and Omicron to have all of those are being tracked. Many of the ones that are talked about, aside from Omicron, are extremely low frequency. And they become worrisome when the frequency continues to rise. And so these are being tracked. And for the moment, there is nothing that has reached a frequency that is extremely worrisome, like Omicron did initially or like Delta did initially.
There has been kind of this, well, I don't know if the mythology, they said, because of how quickly Omicron is spreading and and being infectious, that we're seeing the end. Omicron is signaling the end of the coronavirus. Do you see that as the case, or is it just a wishful thinking?
I see a little bit of both. I certainly, from what I said earlier, Omicron is going to rip through the US population and much of the Western European population, and that will raise immunity. And with vaccination rates of 60, 70% already, you could see the herd immunity level achieving, easily 80+%. And that plus the fact that Omicron is not as virulent is going to perhaps bring this to a faster end in these places, but not in the rest of the world. And so this wave will simply go on elsewhere. So it is important to vaccinate the rest of the world, not just with any vaccine, but with the better vaccines. And I think that's an important point that I wish people keep in mind, because you could have a country with, say, 75% vaccination rate, but the antibody responses with some vaccines are so poor that you have to take a discount on that. And so we're not going to bring this to an end unless the whole world works together to enhance the immunity within the global communities.
Here, this is another question. Somebody who said, in a recent symposium, you mentioned that, quote, we must stop chasing the virus and must devise strategies to anticipate its trajectory. And can you elaborate more on that?
Yeah, I think those are the final words in a paper that we recently published in Nature on the Omicron variant. And certainly my lab has been involved in looking at vaccines, looking at antibodies, and looking at variants. And we have indeed been chasing after the variants for over a year. And we need to understand now that this is an endless game if we just simply chase the virus. We also know that the virus has portions of its spike protein that are very well conserved. And we should make sure that when we develop our next generation vaccines or next generation antibody therapeutics, they're targeting those more conserved sites rather than any site on the virus. And those conserved sites would, it's not going to completely eliminate the variant problem, but it will go a long way toward addressing the next variant or the variant after that. And that's exactly the strategy that my laboratory and many other laboratories are using in generating next generation vaccines and antibodies.
So another interesting development, is the vaccines. I guess I'm hearing, what the vaccine that we've gotten, whether it's Pfizer, it's kind of almost at the first generation of vaccine, and there is vaccine 2.0, 3.0. So can you talk more about that? I mean, the work that you're doing, because, like we said before, in short period of time, in less than a year, this vaccine first generation was developed, with all the collaboration with all the pharmaceutical. So can you must have more insight into, the next phase of the vaccine development that's going on, whether it's in US, Europe, or other parts of the world. I wonder if you can address the vaccine questions.
Yeah, the immediate next generation vaccine is going to be built on the Omicron sequence, taking the Omicron spike gene and putting it into the mRNA or other vaccine platforms, and hoping that that would broaden the response to cover Omicron much, much better. Those vaccines are already made and already being put into clinical studies in humans. And if they indeed are better off than boosting with the old vaccines, then they could be rapidly developed and hopefully approved within months. But whether they will, in fact, mediate better protection than not just another booster, that would have to be formally tested. The next generation vaccine I was talking about would go further than just using the Omicron. And there is certainly lots of work ongoing in that regard.
Can you now also address, I mean, the treatments? I think, we all remember President Trump's crazy treatment in the very beginning, and I can't remember chloroquine, whatever. But now, I mean, in a matter of months, in a very short period of time, you're hearing a lot of effective drugs develop. So, and even now with Omicron, although it's infectious, it's not as deadly. So can you talk about the treatment, some of the drugs the pharmaceutical company are working on, that it no longer, a year ago, it was like, it's almost like for certain immunocompromised or elderly, it's almost like a death sentence. But now that doesn't seem the case. So the treatment has also really developed very rapidly. So I wonder if you can talk about that.
Yeah, so in terms of chemical drugs, we have three. One is remdesivir, and that was developed some time ago and was simply tested on COVID and shown to be helpful. And so that came along very early in 2020. But drugs that are specifically developed for COVID-19, there are two. One made by Merck that blocks the replication machinery of the virus, and then a second one developed by Pfizer, which attacks the enzyme protease, which is a enzyme that cuts the viral proteins from big pieces to smaller ones. And both have shown to be effective in patients, although the Merck drug is only 30% effective. So its benefit is quite modest. And the Pfizer drug's effectiveness is 89%, so that's great. And then there are antibody drugs that have been developed by companies such as Lilly and Regeneron and GlaxoSmithKline. And some of those were already being affected by the previous variants, but most of those have been knocked out by the Omicron variant because of the mutations in the spike. And now the next generation antibodies are coming. There are many in the works that would take care of Omicron. So again, to have multiple weapons in our therapeutic arsenal in such a short period of time is truly unprecedented, and more are being developed. So the scientific response is truly pretty impressive.
Here we have a question. I'm really glad to see. I was worried that no question, but there's a lot of question coming in from the audience. And one of the question is really interesting. He said, "Why take a third dose of I guess, vaccine if you still have antibodies?"
I lost you for just a split second. Why take a third dose?
A third dose of vaccine if you still have antibodies.
Because the antibodies do wane with time. So, and that waning has been shown in Israel and other places to be associated with a loss in protection. And that's why the booster shot was recommended based on laboratory evidence as well as clinical data, so that boosting would restore the antibody levels and restore the efficacy or the protection rate.
I think there's a lot of question here about, we've talked about zero COVID and living with COVID. And I guess one of the questions directly asked, we in Hong Kong, we have been kind of under lockdown, well, not quite lockdown, but this last few weeks because of the Omicron and some Delta. The government have closed quite a few of the public venues, restaurants closing at 6. No dinner is served, and Chinese New Year is just around the corner. So it's going to be a very depressing Chinese New Year, like last night Chinese New Year was. And so a lot of people in a question here in Hong Kong is, when are we going to, what is the cost of zero COVID? And in some city electrical members said Hong Kong must learn to live with the coronavirus. So what do you think? What does learning to live with coronavirus mean?
I think to me, it means trying to back away from zero COVID, because that's in the long run is not sustainable. And if you don't vaccinate your population, you're delaying the consequences. You're not avoiding the consequences. So, but to do that correctly, you need to highly vaccinate your population with better vaccines. And at least in Hong Kong, you have reasonable access to the Pfizer-BioNTech vaccine. And so for Hong Kong, my recommendation is to vaccinate extensively with the mRNA vaccines that you could purchase. And you certainly have the purchasing power in Hong Kong. And so you need to then raise the immunity in your population, and then also have access to the chemical drugs that I mentioned earlier, particularly the Pfizer drug. Then you don't need to fear the virus anymore, because even if infection continues, you're not going to have the kind of mortality that we witnessed in 2020. And you have the vaccine will mitigate the severity of the disease, and the drugs will do the same. And we have the possibility to turn COVID-19 into a flu-like or cold-like illness with these medical interventions. And that's what I would think is living with COVID-19. And the benefit we get is to return to normalcy. Right now, if you say you're going to accept this lifestyle for the next 5 years, 10 years, then by all means. But I think to most people, that's not acceptable. But we got to find a way out. And to find a way out, you have to vaccinate your population well.
Okay, we have a question also coming from Zoom here from Mark Michelson. Earlier this week at the World Economic Forum, President Xi pledged to embrace cooperation with the national community and other countries to jointly overcoming the pandemic. To what extent has this cooperation been occurring to this point, especially between China and the West? How effective could collaboration be going forward in combating the pandemic? And that's a question many of us have wondered, should the collaboration been there at the beginning?
Yeah, unfortunately, as you know, U.S.-China relations is not at a good point. So in terms of collaboration between U.S. and China, there's too little. In terms of collaboration between Western Europe and China, there's also too little. But China has been a good citizen particularly to the developing world by providing its vaccines. In terms of vaccine distribution to the developing world, China probably leads the way. But the problem is that issue could backfire, because the Chinese vaccines made by Sinopharm and Sinovac are not as good. And sooner or later, the rest of the world still need to be boosted or immunized with the better vaccines. So overall, I would put the international collaboration effort at best a modest grade. It could be done a lot better. And unfortunately, the political tension is getting in the way of public health.
And we have some question here coming about vaccinating children, and here in Hong Kong, because I think the government has just lowered the age. I think kids over 5 can, after Chinese New Year, they will have access to Pfizer-BioNTech, and also the Chinese vaccination as well. So I guess the question here from the audience is about the impact of vaccinating the children. What is your thoughts on that in terms of, how soon? And right now, a lot of the parents are worried, kids not being able to see their grandparents and so on and so forth. So can you talk about vaccination of children?
Well, I think, what you just said sounds like the Hong Kong policy mimics the US policy. So the Pfizer, for example, has tested their vaccines and gotten approval in the US for anyone older than 5 and older. And so that's pretty similar. And, children remain the most susceptible population in that vaccination is just beginning to take place, particularly young children. The teens have been approved for vaccination for quite some time, at least in the US. But the younger children of 5 to 12 are just getting vaccinated. And so much of that population remains susceptible to infection and to disease. And so with this Omicron wave in the US, for example, we're seeing unprecedented numbers of infection and hospitalization among children. And so we need to get moving on that. And the other vaccines that have been approved, I suspect soon they will be approved for children. Now, for children even younger, those studies are ongoing, and there's no official recommendation right now. And of course, vaccination affects schools and school attendance and participation. And it's a huge debate in the US as to what to do with all that.
I think Bob Rogers asking, what is the impact of better testing for the virus?
That's a very, very important point. We need to develop tests that could be applied easily, cheaply, simply, to tell a person whether he or she is carrying the virus. And this, imagine if you could, before you walk into a large room with 50 other people, if you could assure yourself that each one was just tested and was negative, then you could gather safely. This could affect getting on an airplane, going to a party, going into a restaurant. And such tests are available and they are widely used in Europe, but they're minimally used in the US and elsewhere. And those tests could be had for $1 to $2, $3 at most per test. So at least on it, and my laboratory has developed one such test, and I've been using it since November of 2020. Whenever I need to have people gather, say at my house for dinner, let's say it's for 8 or 10 people, everyone would take a test prior to in the hours prior to. And if everyone's negative, even though that test is not as sensitive as the so-called PCR, it actually corresponds better with infectiousness. And so if it's negative, you could safely gather. And testing of that sort is going to be a valuable tool in addressing this pandemic. And right now, you could say, well, UK, for example, is giving such tests away to its citizens, whereas US, you could hardly find such tests in the drugstores. So this is a logistical failure on the part of the US government.
It sounds like the mask thing all over again, or we started off 2 years ago, not enough masks and not enough PPE equipments, and 2 years later, we're still, for a country like America, US, we're still not having enough tests. That sounds, that is not a problem here in Hong Kong, I think. Here, we just, the government goes in and take over a building, and within 24 hours, 12 hours, the entire building is tested. And then, and I'm not sure how that would work in the United States. But here, one other question. I guess I'm not sure if I can read this correctly. What is your opinion about the combination of virus with a COVID-like florana? Does that make sense? Flurona. I'm sorry. It's yeah.
Yeah, I think that's probably asking about a recombination between flu and coronaviruses. Those two, while some sequences could be swapped, a true recombination of those two viruses would probably not likely, given that they're such different viruses. One is a member of corona, and the other is totally different. So I'm not overly concerned with that.
Here's another question about booster. Here in Hong Kong, and I've heard different months, they recommend, why does the policy for receiving a booster insist on waiting 6 months? Why not shorter time frame? And in other countries, I've heard, booster can happen. I think even Israel, they're recommending after a few weeks. So why is that? Is it each country have their own timeline? Here in Hong Kong, I think a few weeks ago, I think it's they recommend the booster after 4 to 6 months. So can you address that question of receiving the booster, waiting after 6 months?
Yeah, I think the reason for the booster is because antibody level wanes and protection is partially lost. And the 6 months recommendation is based on studies of a population. And of course, within the population, there's a great deal of variability. Some people will wane faster and others wane slower, and 6 months is sort of the average, and hence the recommendation. But I think the question is right in that some people may need that booster earlier because of faster waning. And given what I know of the US practice, some places are not so strict. So 4 or 5 months, 4, 5, 6 months, people could get their booster. And in many places, if you want to be boosted, no questions are asked. So even though there is such a guideline, it's not strictly implemented in at least in certain pharmacies in the US. And I see no reason why some individuals couldn't have a booster earlier. And there are certainly exceptions made for those who are extremely elderly, those with immunodeficiencies or underlying conditions that might require a booster sooner.
And my understanding is some places are also allowing the booster if people are traveling, especially long distance is in certain countries, I guess. But I think I want to let the audience know, although we're coming on the top of the hour, Dr. Ho has kindly agreed. I know because there were a lot of questions to stay a little bit longer, but he has to leave definitely in about 15, 20 minutes. But I want to take this opportunity because it's rare that I get this opportunity to ask David, having not seen him in person in quite a few years, and really to pay tribute to him, because it is because of David, Dr. Ho, that this series was started in February of 2020, when we first heard about it. Because I think, David, as you will recall, it was 2003. I had just started working at Committee of 100, and our first major conference, our first conference that I was working on, and you were one of the co-chairs. And, we all of a sudden, we heard about this thing called SARS in Hong Kong, and you were traveling to Hong Kong to consult with the government. And I remember the conference turned out to be what we thought was going to be a disaster, turned out to be quite successful, because those who was going to Asia could not go to Asia, and they showed up at the conference. And at the last minute, we put together, with your leadership, this panel on SARS. And I remember it was you, Dr. Alice Wong, and Elizabeth Rosenthal from New York Times, who had just left Beijing to return to New York to work. And the three of you put together one of the best panel, and it was the first time I heard of coronavirus. I had no idea, and you and Alice and Elizabeth really just in that hour session, or it might have been an hour and a half, illuminated all of us on SARS. And can you kind of talk about, I wanted to kind of go back to that because Hong Kong, as you know, we lived with SARS. I fortunately did not. I was in New York back then. But do you think that what are some of the lessons that you maybe you think the community, the public health community had learned from SARS? We were very proud in Hong Kong that we kind of, when this coronavirus hit in 2002, in the beginning of 2020, we took action right away, and everybody's still wearing masks. Everything is clean. So, but from your personal perspective, what are some of the stuff that maybe we have learned from SARS, if any?
Yeah, I think SARS certainly colored the experience for folks in Greater China, and folks outside of that region took it too lightly. SARS to Hong Kong was devastating, and yet it was hardly appreciated in the US. SARS infected 8,000 people, killed 800 approximately. And so it's dwarfed in magnitude by what's going on with COVID-19. But it taught China and Hong Kong, Taiwan, certain parts of Asia, a real lesson. And that really benefited those places in responding to COVID. And we have to keep in mind, SARS was the first coronavirus outbreak of its kind, not inclusive, of course, the coronaviruses that have been in circulation for a long time, okay, the common cold coronaviruses. But then some years later, 8-9 years later, came MERS out of the Middle East. And of course, 2019 came Omicron, came COVID-19. So we now have had 3 coronavirus outbreaks in the last 20 years. And so there's a major lesson there. More will come. And the common source for all of these are viruses in the bat population. And we know there are many more in bats, particularly bats in southern China and Southeast Asia. And as our world conditions change with the climate, with the population density, with migration, there surely will be more cross-species transmission from bats into humans or bats through another animal into humans. And so we need to expect more of this to come. It may not come in a few months or a few years, but more will come. That is a certainty. We just don't know when. And we should not repeat the mistake that's been made after SARS. After SARS, we completely stopped studying coronaviruses. Not completely, but largely stopped. And we just assume that pandemics are not such a huge threat. And yet from this experience, we know pandemics are as much of a threat, if not more, than, say, weapons of mass destruction. And so this is a global security issue and has to be taken as such. And there has to be continual preparedness for the next pandemic. And coronaviruses has to be near the top of the list, along with influenza and several others. And so we cannot be complacent once again following COVID-19. When we do get to the end, we have to remain vigilant in monitoring for future outbreaks.
We have 2 questions here that are kind of direct opposites about vaccination. One question is, what do you say to those who are not vaccinated? And the other side of this question says, many side effects of the vaccination were not disclosed or discovered until millions were coerced to be vaccinated. What happens to the principle of informed consent? So this is two direction of the question about vaccination and informed consent. What is your thoughts on that?
Well, I think in terms of the first question, vaccinating, convincing people to get vaccinated. I think we know the protection conferred by vaccines, particularly the better ones. And therefore, if you could say, well, I'm young, I could deal with it and get over it, that's probably going to be largely true. But sooner or later, a virus like Omicron will find you if you're unvaccinated. And if you're unvaccinated, you're more likely to have a severe disease, more likely to go to the hospital, more likely to die from it. And so the vaccine is for your own protection, as well as protection for the community and to return the community back to normal as soon as we can. In terms of the vaccine side effects, surely everything that we administer has some side effect. It depends on the frequency. For the side effect that's been most worrisome have come from the vaccination with so-called viral vector vaccines made by Johnson & Johnson and made by AstraZeneca. And those induce not only antibodies to the virus, but also antibody to a so-called platelet factor. And that causes certain clotting issues. But they're still extremely rare. But they're worrisome because of the severity of the side effect. But on balance, you could look at it from the perspective of the FDA or WHO or any other regulatory agency. The benefit outweigh the risk by a huge amount. So the recommendation holds. If you try to say that side effects occur in the millions, yes, and everybody has, not feeling well, cold-like symptoms, but you get that with many vaccines that we take regularly. So once again, it's weighing the risk to the benefit. To say that you have severe consequences to millions of people, that's simply not right.
Right now, we have, I can't believe we still have questions about masks, which is something that here in Hong Kong, everyone wears. And lately, the government has come out recommending, and some people have said the N95 mask is better to protect against Omicron. Do you believe the standard medical mask also sufficient for those who have been vaccinated?
Given the contagiousness of Omicron, in our hospital, we've gone to the same recommendation. If you could get N95 or KN95 mask, that's the best. Next come the surgical mask, and then come the cloth mask. And in the hospital setting, we're now required to wear the N95 or KN95 mask. These are not the kind of study my lab performs, but others have performed those tests and showed them to be truly superior. And I believe that's right, given the infectiousness of Omicron.
I want to kind of wrap this up because I want to thank David so much for your time, but it's been such a great honor to see you and talk to you, and forgive me for my stupid questions, but I find that asking these questions make me feel better, and I think in some ways also make our audience feel better in that I think it's always great to hear from the source, to get away from all of the noise of fake news and all that, and talk to the expert directly and ask the stupid questions from some of us who are laymen. But I think one of the things I do not want to leave without talking to you about your work in AIDS. It was just a few weeks ago, Asia Society, we hosted a private meeting. I think you know Margaret Chen, former head director of WHO, who's now the head of public health at Tsinghua. And she had a discussion with Professor Michelle Williams at Harvard, where you attended, on the T.H. Chan School of Public Health, and they've signed a collaborative MOU of collaborating, which is something that it's really great to hear. As you said earlier, it's because of the collaborations and some of the building on success of others that the vaccine can be developed so quickly. And despite the tension of Sino-US relations, there are things that we can still learn from each other. And you have been on the forefront of just using science, your passion, your research, your work on science. And I don't want to leave this conversation without talking about AIDS. In fact, Margaret reminded us that it was 1980, it was 40 years ago. Has it been, and you were Time Man of the Year, later on, but when AIDS hit, I remember, I think I was still in college and so on. So that fear of AIDS but in over time, your work has helped to alleviate, your work with Magic Johnson and so on. So kind of, again, going back to the question I asked earlier about lessons learned from SARS, what have you learned in your career from your work in AIDS? And then if we can end on also, I'd love to hear what you're doing now at Columbia. You're continuing your work in the area of science, and in the area of AIDS. As I recall, watching some of the videos from 1981, Anthony Fauci was there with you. You both were looking a lot younger then, but AIDS was the beginning, for many of us anyway, awareness of public health on a human basis. So I think the question is your work on AIDS, but then what are you working on now?
Yeah, AIDS certainly was, the previous pandemic, and it's still an ongoing pandemic, although overshadowed by COVID-19. We have to remember AIDS infected 70 million people, approximately, and half of them have died. And the other half is living with the infection. If untreated, would be 99% lethal. So it's a much deadlier virus, but it's much more insidious. It spreads more slowly. It kills more slowly, whereas COVID-19 is so acute. But everything we learn in the process of addressing AIDS has been applied to COVID-19. The drug development effort. The first protease inhibitor was developed for AIDS, and now there's a protease inhibitor for COVID-19. The polymerase inhibitors were developed for AIDS, and now there are 2 such chemical drugs to treat COVID-19. And all the antibody and vaccine effort. HIV, we still don't have a vaccine, and yet the intensive effort has led to a lot of platform technologies that are now being applied to COVID-19, the mRNA and the so-called viral vector platforms. And so it's been tremendously helpful. And then AIDS gives us an example that you have a fearsome, deadly virus that scared the heck out of all of us, and yet within 15 years after recognition, it was transformed into a manageable condition. And now there are 25 million people on drugs that is sustaining them and probably giving them a pretty normal lifespan. So that's what medical research could accomplish. And I think it gives us hope that we could do the same for COVID-19 and future pathogens that will emerge. I would say my lab now is largely focused on COVID-19. We put the HIV work on back burner and trying to help to respond to this pandemic. And we've been doing work largely isolating monoclonal antibodies that could be turned into therapeutics. And that effort has shifted to be more specifically focused on Omicron and future variants of COVID-19. We also study vaccine strategies that could be used for next generation platforms. And then we've been tracking variants because that is so important to this global effort. So those are the principal areas that my lab has been focused on. And I take this opportunity to commend my colleagues. As I said earlier, many of them spent a good part of 2020 living in student dormitories, working double time. And just give you an example of the kind of effort they put in. When Omicron was detected and announced to the world one day before Thanksgiving, so in late November, my colleagues sprung into action. And within 2 weeks, they finished the work, allowing us to submit a paper on Omicron to Nature, which in turn accepted the paper within a few days. That's the kind of response that we as a group have generated. And really, it's due to the tremendous dedication and diligence of talented scientists. And that, while true for my group, is also true for many, many other groups throughout the globe. So the response from the scientific community has truly been tremendous.
Well, on that note, I want to thank you so much for joining us this evening. Again, every time I finish a talk like this, I feel better. I can sleep better tonight, knowing that scientists like you and your team are working on it. And in the meantime, we just have to live with our zero COVID strategy and quarantine. Hong Kong is very resilient, and I think David, you pointed out the SARS. It was pretty dark period too back then, and AIDS. I remember it was pretty dark for some of the in the beginning of it. So I think there is light at the end of the tunnel. We just don't know. Would you like to take a kind of a prediction on the light at the end of the tunnel? When can we see it? I kept on asking that question. A year ago, I said light at the end of the tunnel, but I'm from your expert eyes, when is the light coming?
I think I could speak with greater confidence for the US. And I think, after this wave, we'll go a long way toward normalcy. And I think by 2023, we will learn to live with the virus. Now, we have to also anticipate another variant and deal with that. But I think the situation will get better and better, and people will fear the virus less and less.
Thank you, David. And as you could see from behind David, we started talking when it was dark out behind by his window, and now it's light. And you have shed light on this issue on COVID tonight. And I want to again thank those of you for joining us, and please continue to tune in, even though the center, Asia Society Hong Kong Center, is closed physically, but we are still working, and I'm so proud of my team who's putting together this program and other programs online. Because we're going to be with you, and we're going to shed more light. There's on this issue, as well as other issue concerning Sino-US, and episode 33 will be coming up in February, when I will have another chance. Professor Ben Cowling has been my Valentine date for the last 2 years. It started at February 14th, 2020, and then last Valentine's Day, he was with me. And then this time, February 16th, I will be in discussion with him about from more the Hong Kong perspective. And he also has some really interesting view about zero COVID and quarantine and all that. So those of you who are interested, please tune in. And I want to thank the Asia Society Global Network. In fact, this program is not just an Asia Society Hong Kong program, but an Asia Society program. I know many of my colleagues, whether it's in Europe, US, or Asia, I know they're tuning in tonight with their members. And again, I want to thank them for joining us. And again, David, my heartfelt gratitude. And I look forward to seeing you in person soon in the Year of the Tiger. And my very best wishes of healthy and safe Chinese New Year to you and your family. And thank you all for joining us. And good night.